morning, everyone. Thank you very much for making time in your busy schedules to come and be with us today. I am Renee O'Leary. I am a doctoral student in the Social Dimensions of Health, and I'm a graduate student at the Centre for Addictions Research, BC. And I am standing in today for our director, Dr. Tim Stockwell, who is out of town, or he would certainly be here to do the announcing today. I'd also like to take a moment and thank Royal Jubilee for offering us a chance to put the talk on here in this lovely room and a chance to share it with other places going around here. We really feel that this kind of information is important because CAR-BC, one of the major pillars of our mandate is harm reduction. And if you're curious about our mandate, it is on the phone in the back. So thank you very, very much for coming. Our speaker today, Dr. Linda Bauld, is a professor of health policy and also the director of the Institute for Social Marketing at the University of Stirling. She is also the deputy director for the UK Centre for Tobacco and Alcohol Studies. She works on many committees working on policy, and she is active in both the tobacco and the alcohol areas. I also know from my own experience right now that she's part of an effort to address the World Health Organization on issues of harm reduction with e-cigarettes. So she's been a very, very busy person. We're quite happy today to have Dr. Bauld with us. And I'm also very appreciative that Dr. Bauld has taken time away from her vacation schedule to be able to come and speak to us today. Hold on just a moment. Looks like we're looking for something for a speaker here. We'll be right starting on it. Okay, Linda?
That's super. Can everybody hear me okay? I just had instructions here about this microphone. Okay, is that all right? So thank you very much, Renee. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm actually here on holiday. My parents live in Victoria. I spent my teenage years here, so it's a great place to be. And I've always had an interest in tobacco control policy in Canada in recent years. Now, Renee has explained to me the audience is made up of colleagues from the university, from here in the hospital, and we've also got a few family friends of mine in the audience. So thank you very much indeed for joining us today. I'm going to kick off by telling you a little bit about my main areas of interest and background, and then I'm going to move into the topic of tobacco harm reduction and try and explain some of the basic building blocks of this issue, both in Canada and in the UK, and then move on to talk about electronic cigarettes, which are the new thing that's popped up really and has become almost a consumer revolution in the last 3 to 4 years in most developed countries. So my background, I'm a social scientist, I'm an applied policy researcher, and for the last 15 years most of my work has been on smoking cessation. So I've run trials and observational studies of interventions to help adults who want to stop smoking to quit. Much of that has been with pregnant women, but with the general adult population, and including in some of the most disadvantaged parts of Europe. So those are my main areas of interest, and as Renee said, more recently I've been working on alcohol policy as well. And in that area, we've used a lot of evidence from BC and other Canadian provinces on minimum unit pricing, which is an issue we're working on very, very hard in the UK at the moment. But what about harm reduction? So the background for this is the tobacco epidemic. Now, many of the countries that I go and speak in or work in, like in Eastern Europe, in some parts of Africa now, and also in South America, the tobacco epidemic is at a different stage. Here in BC, you have some of the lowest smoking rates in the world, but in many countries that's not the case. And it's important to remember that tobacco is still the leading preventable cause of death in the world. It's responsible, we know now, for about 1 in 10 deaths, premature deaths in adults worldwide, and it's the only risk factor for all of the 4 major non-communicable diseases, and the cause of 1 in 6 NCD deaths globally. So as Renee said, I work a lot with the World Health Organization. The NCD agenda is a priority. And we know that about 15,000 people lose their lives every day because of tobacco. And as most of you know, 1 in 2 regular smokers will be killed by combustible tobacco consumption if they continue to smoke. So that's the harsh reality. In Canada, you've made tremendous progress and are often held up as an international example of success, particularly because of interventions you introduced earlier than some other countries. Things like, in particular in British Columbia, your smoke-free laws, which were really pioneering at the time, in particular in Victoria, the visual health warnings you have on cigarette packs, where Canada was a leader, and a number of other policies. So the smoking rates now in Canada have significantly gone down and are about 17% in the country as a whole. And my understanding is in BC they're about 13%, and in BC have historically been the lowest. So you are ahead of us in terms of where we are in the UK. Now, I'm sure many of you have visited the UK, some of you may be from there originally or have family there, and you'll know when you come to the UK, smoking appears more visible than it does here in Victoria. We've made huge strides. If you imagine that in the 1960s and 70s, 2/3 of men in the UK were smokers, and almost half of women. And we've now gone down to 1 in 5 adults. So even though our rates are highest now, we had the furthest distance to travel. And we've seen continual and successive reductions in our smoking rates, particularly since 1999. And in contrast to Canada, rates amongst men and women are very similar in the UK, and indeed in many European countries like Norway, where women's rates are slightly higher than men's. In Canada, your female smoking rates are still a little bit lower. Some of that is cultural, there are other reasons for that. But what happens in practice in the 1 in 5 adults who still smoke in the UK and the legacy of the tobacco use of the 1960s and 70s and even before that? The bottom line, and we have the best cohort studies in the UK to demonstrate this, is the gap in life expectancy. So many of you will be familiar with the British Doctors study that I'm going to show you a slide of in a moment, which started in the 1950s, Dahl and Pito, who tracked British clinicians through time and looked at the survival rates and saw the difference between smokers and non-smokers. We now have these types of data for women. This is the Million Women study led by Valerie Barral and colleagues at the University of Oxford, and they find that on average women lose 11 years of life if they continue to smoke compared to their non-smoking neighbours. And this is the British Doctors study, and what Dahl and Pito were able to do was track the difference between somebody who continued to smoke and somebody who stopped smoking. And what these graphs show you is the people who continue to smoke are the blue lines. The people who stopped smoking are the little blue kind of broken lines, and then the non-smokers are the red lines. So you can see the difference in life expectancy between the blue and the red lines, and then the people who stop smoking at different ages. So essentially those who stopped between the ages of 25 and 34, in terms of life expectancy, they caught up with the non-smokers. They managed to eliminate most of the risk, not all, but most of the risk of continuing to smoke. But even for the people who stopped smoking between, say, 55 and 64, there was a significant increase in life expectancy. So what we know from the British Doctors study and many other studies, including in the US and other countries, is that smoking cessation works, and it works at any age. It has health benefits, a variety of them, at any age. And I know we've got clinicians in the room who worked on this topic and have seen the benefits of that. So what have we done in the UK to try and encourage not only adult smokers to stop, but young people not to start? So we've basically thrown everything at it. We've used every tool in the tobacco control armory to try and reverse the tobacco epidemic. And we've been doing this for decades. And we have something called the Tobacco Control Scale in Europe, which essentially is some work that Martin Raw and Luc Joossens do, and they do it annually. They try and rank European countries and how well they're doing in tobacco control. Those of you that are familiar with this area will know that the types of policies we're talking about here are tax, which is probably the most important, most effective, education in schools, for example, banning all forms of advertising and promotion, including removing point-of-sale displays, which you did in BC before we did. We've just introduced that in the last couple of years. labeling and packaging, visual health warnings, and then supply side measures. I noticed on the front of the Saanich News this morning there was a story about contraband, illicit tobacco, still being a problem in the province, as it is in most developed countries. So it's tackling things like illicit tobacco. So we've done all of those things, and we also have free at the point of use treatment services, a bit like your quit lines that you have in BC, but in addition, face-to-face, community-based support that's free at the point of use and provides medication. So the UK is at the top of the tobacco control scale in Europe and has been for a number of years. And I guess the last bit of the jigsaw is that we are likely to introduce plain packaging in the next few years, just like Australia. It's been passed by our government. We've just got to go through the whole painful process of litigation against the tobacco industry, which happens every time we introduce a new policy, as it will do here. So we've done this, but we still have 1 in 5 adults who smoke. So what else do we do? Now, from my perspective, that's not shared by everybody, the other bit of the jigsaw is tobacco harm reduction. It's another tool in the armory to stop adults from, to support them to stop smoking. And people say, well, why should you focus on adult cessation? What we really should be doing is preventing the next generation of children from ever touching combustible tobacco. So what we would say in response to that is the single most important thing you can do to prevent a child from becoming a smoker is make sure they're not surrounded by adult smokers. Because we know that children who live in a smoking household are far more likely to become smokers themselves. So adult cessation is key to youth prevention. And this is where harm reduction comes in. So the benefits of smoking cessation are clear. I've explained those, and you'll be familiar with other aspects of that I've maybe not talked about. We know cessation works, and we know that all over the world, every day, people stop smoking, and most of them do it without any assistance. Most of them have tried multiple times, but they might just wake up one morning and decide, that's it. It's the cost, it's my health, it's my family nagging me, my doctor told me to do it, whatever. However, when they try, in most instances people fail, and that's why people try and try again. But there are ways to maximize success rates, and the ways to maximize that are to provide people with effective stop smoking medications, of which we have 3 types that are available in Canada and the UK: nicotine replacement therapy, varenicline and bupropion, and then there are other drugs like cytosine that are available in Eastern Europe and other countries. And then combine that with advice through a quit line or face-to-face support. But even though we have world-class cessation services in the UK and you've got good services here in BC, most people don't use them. That's the problem that we face. So low likelihood of success from cold turkey willpower quitting, and then less than 10% of smokers wanting to access help. Those who don't want to access help are usually trying to cut down, and I'll show you the extent to which that is happening. So smoking reduction or temporary abstinence, in other words, stopping smoking for a short period of time, are the other options. So cutting down or not doing it for a while. Now we know the benefits of that are it protects people from secondhand smoke for the period that it's happening. But what are the benefits for the continuing smoker? Why bother? Does cutting down make a difference? And this is important because in one of the areas I do most of my work on smoking and pregnancy, pregnant women still will say to me or the midwife, well, isn't it good enough that I just cut down from 20 to 3 cigarettes a day, for example? The short answer is it isn't, and I'll show you why. So if people reduce their cigarette consumption alone, and they don't use anything to do that, what are the health benefits? Now there are a number of systematic reviews that show you the evidence. This is just one example. This slide essentially shows you the hazard ratio for mortality, whether there's a reduced risk or there's an increased risk of death when people stop smoking or they cut down their smoking. The red bars are cutting down and the white bars are smoking cessation. And you can see that the reduced risk for cutting down only occurs, and it only occurs to a very small extent, for tobacco-related cancer. And it's still really relatively small when you look at the evidence as a whole. So the take-home message is that there aren't clear health benefits to cutting down. And I'll show you another study that we did in Scotland. This is the Renfrew and Paisley study. Renfrew and Paisley, I know some of you in the audience know that area, is a deprived part of the west of Scotland. in the 1970s, unbelievably, they were able to recruit 80% of the local population into a cohort study that was a post-war study looking at health generally. It wasn't about smoking, but they also asked them about their smoking. And they followed them up a few years later, and they looked at the people who'd cut down. This was just part of the data set that was included. So we were able to look at whether there was a difference in survival, and these people were tracked up to 1990, almost 2000 in terms of their death rates, and by then 80% of the participants had died. Look at whether there was an increase or a decrease in the risk of death. And what we found overall was that people who reduced their smoking didn't enjoy any significantly extended survival compared to those who continued to smoke. So the message from that study again was reduction in itself, in this particular study, doesn't extend your life. In very heavy smokers who cut down a lot, we did see some effect, but they were a small portion of the sample. And I think some of you know the reasons for that. When people cut down their cigarette consumption, they engage in what's known as compensatory smoking. And some of you here know that, but others may not have heard that term. It basically means that you smoke the remaining cigarettes harder, longer, right down to the butt. You take in more of the tar, the toxins, from each individual cigarette. So even though you're reducing your number of cigarettes, you're still taking in almost as much of the harmful stuff as you would have done if you were smoking the same number. And that's why you don't see the benefits. However, the barrage of studies that we have that look at smoking reduction don't do one important thing. They look at people who cut down and didn't use anything else. So it's just cutting down, it's not using other medication. If you cut down your smoking and you use licensed nicotine-containing products like nicotine replacement therapy, what happens then? And here we have new data that we looked at in our harm reduction guidance that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And for me, this is one of the most important slides. It kind of provides a rationale for why cutting down under certain circumstances should be encouraged and not rejected, particularly for smokers who are heavily nicotine dependent. So just to explain this slide, because it's complicated, this shows you the proportion of smokers who report making a quit attempt in a given year. At one end of the slide here, you have the smokers who are not really making any significant effort to stop or to cut down. And only around 18% of them report making a quit attempt in the previous year. So even though they may not have intended to try and stop, may not have intended to try and cut down, some of them end up trying to stop anyway. Maybe it's New Year or whatever, that's what they decide to do. The other bars, the next one shows you people who engage in cutting down what we call smoking reduction, that's the SR, with nicotine replacement therapy. And you can see a higher proportion of them, around 40%, report making a quit attempt in the past year. And then you see the people who engage regularly in temporary abstinence with nicotine replacement therapy. So maybe they can't smoke at all for the whole working day, for example. And then those who engage in smoking reduction, cutting down with NRT, and those who engage in smoking reduction and temporary abstinence with NRT. Sorry, the second one was without nicotine replacement therapy. So the bottom line is those people who report that they engage in cutting down and temporary abstinence with nicotine replacement therapy, 72% of them report trying to quit in the past year. And these are people who didn't necessarily intend to stop smoking at all. So what that says to me is that smoking reduction is a pathway to cessation for some people if they replace the nicotine in their cigarettes with licensed nicotine-containing products. And the benefits of doing that are they're not necessarily then engaging in the compensatory smoking that I talked about earlier. Okay? Now these are relatively new data. We'd like to see dozens of studies that show this same pattern, and through time we might have that. Now what I would hypothesize, and this is up for debate, is that electronic cigarettes might operate like nicotine replacement therapy. And if they do, then cutting down with e-cigarettes is potentially a part of the pathway to smoking cessation. I know not everybody accepts that. I'll talk about that in a moment. So who's cutting down? So this is just England. We have a fantastic survey called the Smoking Toolkit Study, which is done every month with smokers in England and run from university colleges. So we get very quick data. You can see here that in any year, somewhere between 52 and 58% of smokers report they're cutting down. So many smokers, most smokers, even if they don't want to stop, are actively making attempts at tobacco harm reduction. Now this isn't rocket science, isn't it? Is it? I mean, most of you here will know that when you ask a smoker, do they want to continue to smoke, they'll say no. But the reason they continue to smoke is for the nicotine. And many people find it incredibly difficult to stop. Not all, but many. And then lower down you'll see there's a small proportion here who are using nicotine replacement therapy to cut down, around 10 to 12%. And then you see the little blue line at the bottom, which starts in March 2011 and goes up to September 2013. Those are the folks who are using electronic cigarettes to cut down. You'll see the rise there. Now, from my perspective, most of my studies have been with our smoking treatment services over a number of years. Less than 10%, it's about 7% of smokers use these services. For years I've been saying to my colleagues, the smokers I would like to engage with in my studies are that red line. Those are the people that I want to be working with. But for lots of reasons they don't come through the door. So how do we work with them? And we're working with them now, and the reason we're working with them now is because of this. So in the UK over a number of years, we've had a fantastic committee in the Royal College of Physicians, the Tobacco Advisory Group, who are always ahead of the game. The RCP produced a report in 1962 called Smoking and Health. Many of you will know it. There was one in the US as well. That report set out the tobacco control measures that we now have in place, and it took 50 years to put them all in place. 50 years. But they produced a report in 2007, long before any of the rest of us were talking about this in policy terms, on harm reduction. And they said, let's have harm reduction as part of our national strategy. And then last year in June 2013, NICE, which is our kind of gatekeeper for whether drugs and treatments are available on our health service, produced national guidance on tobacco harm reduction. And this is a committee that I chaired. That's how I got into the topic. And the committee met for 2 years and looked at all the evidence around harm reduction, including the evidence from Scandinavia on snus, even though that form of tobacco is not legal in the UK or other parts of Europe, and it's not something we were able to recommend. Here are the reduction options in the guidance. So keep in mind that we have literally piles of guidance from the past about how to stop smoking in one step. We know how to help people who want to do that. This is for the others. You can stop smoking in one step and then use licensed nicotine-containing products, possibly indefinitely, something we can maybe talk about. You can cut down prior to quitting with or without the help of one of these products. You can smoke less with or without the help of one or more licensed nicotine-containing products. And you can temporarily abstain with or without the help of one of these products. So these are the kinds of options, harm reduction options. So the first thing is that they essentially emphasize that you can substitute the nicotine in tobacco with nicotine from less harmful nicotine-containing products, potentially on an indefinite basis. Now that's still controversial. I've not got slides in this presentation to show you the evidence, but when you ask somebody in a telephone survey, maybe some of you here, or you even ask a health professional about nicotine, do they think nicotine is harmful? Lots of people still think that nicotine causes cancer. And lots of people still think that nicotine replacement therapy, if you use it over a long period, is harmful. And what the guidance says is that is not the case. There are some groups for whom we recommend that they don't use it, including pregnant women, although pregnant women do use it in some countries. And there are other groups for whom we would advise they wouldn't necessarily use it for a long period. But we have data at least up to 5 years that show that you can continue to use things like nicotine gum, lozenges, the inhalator for a long time. So it was actually, for us, it was a big change to say, don't be afraid if you're concerned about relapse that you continue to use this stuff. And I know lots of smokers who still use NRT. Of course, they're paying for it and it costs, and we would prefer that they didn't spend their money on that, but it's not necessarily risky when you compare it with continuing to smoke. That must always be the comparator. So that's the first thing. Far better than combustible tobacco nicotine replacement therapy. And then the guidance talks about unregulated products like electronic cigarettes. And it says that at the moment we can't recommend them. We can't recommend them in our free at the point of use health service because they're not licensed, they're a consumer product. That's what the guidance says. What it does say, however, is when they become licensed, we will recommend them. And since then, we kind of moved on a bit, and we're now adopting a more informal approach with e-cigarette users that I'll talk about in a second. So there's reason to believe that lifetime use of licensed nicotine-containing products is less harmful than smoking. And in relation to e-cigarettes, we say they're not regulated, but this is the most important sentence, they are expected to be less harmful than tobacco. So when we compare an electronic cigarette with continuing to smoke, and for me that's the only useful comparison, they are less harmful. And we know that from all the studies that we have, at least in the short term. We don't have the long-term data. So what about e-cigarettes? I'm going to move on to talk about them now. This is the chap who invented them in China. That's where they came from. The tobacco industry talked about electronic devices for years, but not marketed them. This is an anatomy of an e-cigarette. This one looks like a cigarette. Some of you here may have used them. You'll certainly be seeing them. Essentially, how it works is there's a cartridge inside the device that holds nicotine and is dissolved in propylene glycol. I'll talk about propylene glycol in a moment. The heater vaporizes the nicotine when it detects that the smoker is taking a drag from the e-cigarette. There's a microprocessor that controls the heater and the light. There's a battery. And then in some of them, there's a little light at the end which serves no purpose at all, except for it to look like a cigarette. In my view, you don't need the light because it just confuses people. But anyway, it's there in relation to what we call the Cigalite devices, the first generation. And they deliver nicotine via inhaled aerosol. And this just shows you some examples of people using e-cigarettes. So what about the devices themselves? Well, I'm aware in Victoria there are lots of different ones on the market, non-nicotine containing as is supposed to be the case, but you are also able to obtain nicotine containing devices. This is kind of the first generation. These are the ones that are first produced. The big brands we have in the UK like E-Lights, Enjoy, Blue, they look like this. Most of these are now owned by the tobacco industry. I'll talk about that in a moment. Then you have what we call second generation electronic cigarettes. These are the ones that you will obtain in the sort of vaping shops which are popping up all over the place. I know you have some in Victoria. They have a cartridge inside them which is refillable. There are different flavorings that are available. It doesn't really look like a cigarette. There's some examples of more second generation, and these are the third generation devices, often called mods, or there's mods associated with them, where people can modify the device, and they don't look at anything like a cigarette. And in the really committed vapors, some of the people that we engage with now in some of our studies and our public engagement work, they tailor these devices for their own particular requirements, and there's all kinds of accessories that you can get with them. So those are what these things look like. And this just shows you, sorry, it's just a rather complicated site, what's happened in the UK. So we now have, in the UK we have about 10 million smokers. We now have over 2 million current e-cigarette users. I mean, this is a phenomenal change. It's actually hard to describe how quickly this has happened and how quickly it's taken many of my colleagues who are still working with an old battery of policies by surprise. We know from our latest survey that about a third of people using e-cigarettes are ex-smokers. Many of them have stopped smoking using e-cigarettes, not all of them, but many of them. And 2/3 of them are current smokers. They're continuing to smoke and they're using an e-cigarette. So that's what we call dual use, something people are concerned about. But for some it may be a pathway to cessation. So you can see in 2010, only 2.7% of smokers had ever tried an e-cigarette, were ever using it, and you see the growth since then. So it really is an exponential rise. And this just shows you what's happened to the sort of cessation market in contrast. People who are trying to stop smoking in the UK, and I imagine this will be mirrored in a number of other countries, 4 in 10 people use nothing when they try and stop. They use willpower alone, the traditional method. We now have 1 in 5 quit attempts in the UK is with an electronic cigarette. 1 in 4 is with an electronic cigarette in the last quarter's data we have. 1 in 5 use nicotine replacement therapy bought over the counter, the type you could buy in Shoppers Drug Mart or London Drugs. The latest data we have is that buying NRT over the counter is largely, not exactly futile, but it doesn't work for most people. If anybody's interested in that, I can go through some of the data that we have on that. People don't use NRT usually as recommended, and for that reason, it's not often successful. I've had stories in some of our studies of people thinking, well, you know, I'd like it to last twice as long, so I'll cut the patch in half, or I'll dry it on the radiator overnight and I'll put it back on the next day. It's that kind of issue. And then the little yellow bit at the top is the proportion, the tiny proportion of people who use our services. But you can see how it's changed. What's happened in practice is the red bars, the e-cigarettes, are taking away from the pharmaceutical industry-driven produced nicotine-containing products. That's who they're competing against. So what's in the cartridge? And should we be concerned? There's nicotine, propylene glycol, glycerin, water, and flavorings. Propylene glycol, the FDA in the US, is an additive that's generally recognized as safe for use in food. It's used to absorb extra water and maintain moisture in lots of different products. You can probably recognize it looks a bit like dry ice. Propylene glycol is used for that as well. It's odorless and tasteless. One thing to say about that, I can't remember if I've got this on another slide. This is not a compound we should necessarily be concerned about. The one thing we don't know is what are the long-term effects of breathing this deep into the lungs over a number of years. That's the question we don't know the answer to. So what do we know about e-cigarettes? This is my sort of summary slide of the studies, and our team track them regularly. They read all the literature that is produced, and I edit the journal Nicotine and Tobacco Research, which publishes a lot of this. There are variable nicotine levels, even in between different brands and batches. So if you took an Enjoy cigarette, not necessarily one of them, but maybe one of the refillable ones, there'd be 2 milligrams of nicotine in one cartridge and 4 in another, or whatever. You really don't know what you're getting, potentially. The nicotine delivery that somebody gets from an e-cigarette varies, and there's a number of different reasons for that. We know that unlicensed products fail to meet standards of safety, quality, and efficacy, as we would expect from a medicinal product, for example. Most e-cigarettes are used by adult smokers to stop smoking or for harm reduction. I'll show you the data on children in a moment. There's some evidence of use by kids, and there's what I regard as promising evidence, emerging evidence of effectiveness. So who uses them? The proportion of users across countries and in studies that we have, 2 to 8 times higher in current smokers than in former smokers. There's little evidence of use in never smokers. And users at the moment tend to be younger, still tend to be better educated, although that's changing, may have a higher income, and there are no differences between men and women. Which is interesting because the studies from Sweden and Norway, so Sweden has the lowest rate of smoking in men in Europe and probably potentially in the developed world, about 12% now, and that's because they use snus, which is an oral tobacco product that sits up in your mouth. Some of you will have been to Sweden and know. Ever seen many Swedish women using it? Not many. It's not a very attractive product. That's not the case with e-cigarettes. Women are using these just as much as men are, which is interesting. So what's the extent of use by never smokers and long-term ex-smokers? So again, this is from the Smoking Toolkit study. This just shows you the proportion of never smokers who are using an e-cigarette in 2013 in the UK and who are using NRT in 2013 in the UK compared to long-term ex-smokers. One thing people often forget is there's a group of never smokers here who routinely use nicotine replacement therapy. Anybody come across any of those? People use nicotine gum because it makes them feel more alert, for example. Most never smokers feel nauseous when they use NRT, but there are some people who use it. And we're seeing a similar proportion of e-cigarette use amongst never smokers. And there's your long-term ex-smokers using e-cigarettes and using NRT. Those 2 bars will start to shift, I think, in the next couple of years. So are children using them? These are my kids, actually. We were making a film which was about point of sale. It had nothing to do with e-cigarettes, nothing at all. And then I noticed in the stills afterwards that it actually looked like my daughter was buying an e-cigarette. Not the intention of this photograph at all, but it just shows you how prevalent they are now in the UK, not so much here. In some shops, e-cigarettes have replaced our lottery tickets, which used to be right on the side of the counter so people could get to them. That's how widely available they are. But are children using them? So this is our latest survey, e-cigarette use amongst 11 to 18-year-olds who have ever heard of e-cigarettes, and e-cigarette use by smoking status amongst 11 to 15-year-olds. Without going through all the details, the proportion of never smoking young people using an e-cigarette in the UK is less than 1%. Those are our figures at the moment. So we've got very little evidence of any regular use of e-cigarettes by children. We have other surveys that ask teenagers, have they ever tried an e-cigarette? And there you see a different picture. You see experimentation with e-cigarettes amongst never smoking children. That is definitely happening. To show you another example, this is cigarette and e-cigarette prevalence in US youth. Some of you will be familiar with this. I have to always remind myself of these figures. In 2012 in the USA, this is a big survey, 7% of teenagers, this is all teenagers, had tried e-cigarettes, and 91% of them were smokers. So not 9% of non-smokers had tried e-cigarettes. So that's a higher proportion. But what you'll see in this slide and in others is that smoking prevalence in young people in almost all developed countries is continuing to drop. When I will start to worry is if I see the use of combustible tobacco in young people starting to rise again in those countries. I don't see any evidence of that. That's what we call the potential gateway effect, where young people experiment with an e-cigarette and then they go on to use a real cigarette. Now, the jury's out, it's early days, I may be proved wrong 5 years from now, but I'm not seeing any evidence of e-cigarettes as a gateway to tobacco smoking. And I know that, not everybody agrees with that perspective, but I guess my view is that until I see the data and it's convincing to me and it's potentially longitudinal, I'm not going to change my perspective on this. What I am worried about, though, is the marketing. And we did a pretty comprehensive audit, not myself, but my colleagues who are experts in marketing research for the UK government. And for us, it's everywhere. It's not nearly so much here that I see. Very understated. Now, these are mild images. I could show you some that are almost pornographic. They're in videos. They're really promoting these products as consumer products, lifestyle, accessories. And because of the flavorings and the marketing, there's no doubt that these will be attractive to young people, at least to try them. So we've had a consultation on controlling some of the marketing and advertising. And the reason why I think that's important is because the research that we do on alcohol and also on energy-dense foods shows, as many of you will know, that if children are exposed to a significant degree of marketing regularly from multiple channels, including digital media, that does affect consumption. We know that it does. So there's probably something going on here, and I think it's something that we need to address. So just a few more bits of evidence. What about the nicotine levels in electronic cigarettes? So this is moving back now to smoking cessation and their potential role here. Do they deliver nicotine? Well, they generate vapor that contains nicotine, but as I said, they differ in their efficacy and the consistency of nicotine vaporization. And we know that most e-cigarettes deliver less nicotine than a conventional cigarette. What about the toxicants in e-cigarettes? People are very concerned about this. What do they deliver? There's a number of studies that have looked at this. Most of this work has been done by Maciek Gonowicz, a colleague of mine who was in the UK and is now at Roswell Park in the US. He's a Polish pharmacist. We know that there's at least 8 toxic compounds that have been identified, but all of these are at significantly lower levels than in conventional cigarettes, between 9 and 450 times lower. But there are things like formaldehyde that are present in e-cigarettes, things that we potentially should be concerned about. But again, the risk profile compared to a combustible cigarette is less. But things we need to look for there. What about exposure to toxicants after switching? I'm just using one example here. Here's a nice small study with 20 cigarette smokers. They were provided with e-cigarettes with cartridges containing nicotine. They were asked to substitute their regular cigarettes with e-cigarettes for 2 weeks, and then their nicotine and the carcinogens in their bodies was measured. So essentially, this is the baseline, and then they use the e-cigarettes to 1 week and then to 2 weeks. And this is, does the nicotine in their bodies essentially drop? You can see that the nicotine levels go down a wee bit between baseline and 1 week, but not a lot. So they're still getting the nicotine from the e-cigarettes. But these are the tobacco-specific nitrosamines, which are the things we need to be worried about. And you can see there that the exposure goes down a lot when they switch from using a tobacco cigarette to an e-cigarette. What about the vapor? I know that many people are concerned about this. We know the vapor contains nicotine. It's probably about 1/10 of what one would be exposed to from a conventional cigarette. And there are other toxic metals, in particular in the vapor, but they're much lower than secondhand smoke. We really don't have any current evidence of health harms from occasional exposure, but the effects of regular exposure, for example, in the home or continually in the workplace, are unknown. Our advice in the UK at the moment is we are not proposing government legislation to ban e-cigarettes everywhere in public places. I know this is contentious, I know it's been discussed here, but we are saying to businesses, it's your choice. And of course, many businesses like transport companies, for example, are said they can't be used. So finally, what about cessation? We've got 2 trials, I'm just conscious of time, which compare e-cigarettes with nicotine replacement therapy or with non-nicotine containing products. And the take-home message here, one from Italy, funded by an e-cigarette company, so we need to be cautious. Second one from New Zealand, better quality, independent. E-cigarettes at the moment are roughly about as effective for smoking cessation as a nicotine patch. That's what these trials show. And then in the UK, a large cohort study just published a few weeks ago, 5,000 smokers, almost 6,000 who tried to stop in the last 12 months, and then looking at what they'd used, willpower, NRT, or e-cigarettes, and then looking at whether there was a difference in smoking cessation after adjusting for a wide range of factors. And what they found was that e-cigarette users were more likely not to be smoking than those using nicotine replacement therapy bought from a shop or those using willpower alone. And when they can adjust it for a whole variety of confounders, because this is an observational study, the odds of e-cigarettes users still being abstinent were 61% greater than those using nothing and 63% greater than those using nicotine replacement therapy bought over the counter. So, take-home message, if you or somebody you know wants to stop smoking, what do you advise? Well, the lowest chance of success is using willpower alone or buying nicotine replacement therapy from a shop. Next up is using nicotine replacement therapy prescribed by a doctor or a nurse prescriber with advice, or buying an e-cigarette from a shop. That's about 50% better. These are the latest data we have. But the highest chances of success, and they're far higher, is combining your quit line or your specialist face-to-face support with licensed, safe medications for smoking cessation, which is about 200% better. But as I said earlier in the presentation, the problem is the vast majority of busy smokers who've got other things going on in their lives don't want to access this kind of support. So here's some of the alternatives. And I think it's really important that people have a choice. So a final point just on regulation. In the UK, we don't have any real current restrictions, although these are going to come in soon. We have something called the EU Tobacco Products Directive, which will come into place in 2016. At the moment, we're passing a law that prevents anybody under the age of 18 from buying e-cigarettes, and that will be enforced in the same way as our point-of-sale schemes for cigarettes are. And then in Canada, as you know, they're not regulated either as a tobacco product or as a medicine at the moment. They're legal as a consumer product if they're not nicotine containing, and many of you will be more familiar with this than I am, I know Renee is, but Health Canada obviously is trying to enforce this real ban, if you will, on nicotine containing e-cigarettes, but with limited success, I would say, in practice. And I won't talk through this in detail, but this, if anybody's interested, this just describes what's going to happen in Europe in a couple of years. 2 final thoughts. Something interesting is going on in the UK, and we can say this because we have the data, because it's so recent. Since I started working in the field in 1998, we've seen smoking prevalence reductions on average of about 0.5 percentage point a year. Since 2012, that's almost doubled. And that's with all the other stuff we have in place. So something is pushing smoking rates down, as measured in our main surveys, at a faster rate than before 2012. The other interesting thing is that there's been an increase in the rate of quitting smoking since e-cigarettes became popular. It's more or less been steady. We had a bit of a rise around our smoke-free laws you will have had here, but it's gone up. It's gone up recently. And I'm not saying this is due to e-cigarettes. We've had our point-of-sale laws. We continue to try and maintain our taxes. We've had a lot of discussion about plain packaging, but something's going on. And luckily or fortunately, nicotine use overall is decreasing. So you would think that, if people are rushing to e-cigarettes, what we're creating is a new generation or an expansion of nicotine addiction. But nicotine use overall is actually going down. And that's because cigarette consumption has decreased, as has overall nicotine use. So it's not a complete replacement. We're losing nicotine users while also gaining some e-cigarette users. My very final slide, and I know this is a big issue, is that by 2016, we have a choice of consumer products that are e-cigarettes or medicinal e-cigarettes. And last week, Voke, this device, which is actually not an e-cigarette, it's a nicotine inhalator, but it looks a lot like an e-cigarette, was granted a medicinal license in the UK. And in a few weeks, another product will be granted a medicinal license in the UK that is an e-cigarette. Both of these products are made, manufactured, and will be promoted, marketed, and delivered by British American Tobacco, which is a tobacco company. Unfortunately, the pharmaceutical industry has not come into this field. The tobacco industry is active, and they're becoming more active as time goes on. So we may be faced with a situation where we have a medicinal product owned by a tobacco company that our National Health Service has to choose whether it makes available to patients or not. That's a pretty difficult place to be, given all we've achieved in recent years. So that's the sort of political angle to this harm reduction debate. It's one I try not to involve myself in, but it's very real. So you can see there's a lot of interesting, hopefully interesting developments there, different perspectives I know in Canada, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts and questions on this topic. Thank you very much.